Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and in the coming beta and expansion for 3.0 Fall of Oriath, there's going to be quite a lot of changes to double dipping and damage over time changes specifically. So they've already released quite a few of these changes in their essay form, and I wanted to just go over it a bit, what it means to us, mere mortals and plebs, and how it's going to impact your game more or less, or what builds you play at the moment. And I'll do my best to explain it from my point of view, which is basically terrible because I can't really understand shit anyway, but I'll try anyway. So they've highlighted what is obvious to us right now in that Poison and Ignite is basically pretty overpowered for a lot of the content in the game right now. You can scale your multipliers to get, infinitely more damage than you currently can with just normal sort of multipliers and damage types, and they're trying to address that by removing the way Poison and Ignite work with your initial skills so that you have a cap on how much you can actually poison or ignite based off of the initial hit of the attack or spell making the poison or ignite. They mention how it's bad for balance, as we all know, and they're trying to bridge the gap between ignite and poison builds, two builds that don't really have any lasting secondary damage, so your cold damage, your shock, or your lightning damage, that sort of stuff. So you're just gonna front load your damage, and a lot more of those builds are probably going to be coming our way, like your Ice Crash or your Frost Blades, and it should be a lot more simple in how you build your characters and what's going to be popular with this 3.0 expansion. The way the system will be changing is actually explained rather well in one of the other posts. There's 4 fucking books for you to read if you really want to about the current changes, but one of the ones that was explained fairly simply is essentially it's going to be like a Molten Strike right now. So you have things that scale the initial hit, and your projectile damage is then scaled off of the initial hit, but it is a separate entity altogether. So projectile damage also scales the projectile portion of the Molten Strike without affecting the initial hit. And that's basically what's going to be happening for Poison, Bleed, and Ignite builds, where you have specific modifiers that will then affect your Poison, Bleed, and Ignite much more so than just things that affect the initial hit and the ignite damage at the same time, thus double dipping. Instead, you're going to be focusing a lot more on your ignite sort of scaling specifically through modifiers that scale ignite, or poison modifiers that say directly your poison damage will get better. They've also said they're going to double the damage of ignite, poison, and bleed just at the very start because of these changes that should eventually nerf it. But from what I can tell, reading all of this and this and this and this, it should still actually be sort of a mechanic that's used, but much more specific and targeted. So you won't just slap bleed or poison onto every single melee attack anymore, and you can't just convert all kinds of damage and then just start doing chaos or poison or ignite damage. You will have to specifically build for it, and things like Viper Strike and Puncture, as they mention throughout this, become a lot more specialized in what they do and known for their bleed or poison rather than just being another way of bleeding and poisoning, and in a lot of cases not even a very good way. So one of the ways in which that's happening is poison and bleed will now be treated as ailments, because previously we had status ailments, that's all the shock, ignite sort of stuff. Now they're just going to be ailments as well as poison and bleed, which means they don't get impacted by skill duration anymore. So you can't just slap an increased duration onto your Chaos Firestorm and then have an increased duration of your Firestorm as well as an increased duration of your poison in that build. It will only now apply your increased duration to specifically a Viper Strike or a Puncture, because those will actually treat poison and bleed as skill effects that then get affected by things like an increased duration, whereas the rest of the skills that then get poison and bleed or ignite that aren't specifically Puncture or Viper Strike have to actually take these new sorts of passives that will increase poison duration or increase bleed duration specifically. So Puncture and Viper Strike get a lot nicer in that they actually inherently will be better for bleed and poison than everything else, which is currently the case. So long story short with that, bleed, ignite, and poison become a lot more targeted and specific, and you have to actually build around them to get adequate and good scaling and damage from them, and they'll still exist in some form and probably still be doable in a lot of builds. But for this first post, that's basically all they're saying, and as well as that, bleeding is going to get better, because currently when bleeding monsters stand still, they take 1/6 of the bleed damage, and in the future they're going to take half of that damage instead while standing still, while taking full bleed damage while running around. That effect isn't going to be applied to us, so you know, we'll still be fine for bleed damage. As far as their second post is concerned over damage over time changes, the important stuff: damage, ailments, and critical strikes. So your crit damage multiplier won't any longer influence poison, bleed, and ignite, and instead there's going to be a specific node that you take to impact your poison, bleed, ignite with critical strikes, and it's now going to be called damage multiplier for ailments from critical strikes, which is a bit of a mouthful, and you'll have to specifically, as I mentioned just earlier, spec into this sort of stuff to be more specialized for your poison, ignite, and bleed, rather than just getting it everywhere. And it sounds like it'll still be okay, and you'll still probably grab it and potentially spec into that sort of stuff, especially as an assassin, for example. It'll probably still be really good. It's just, it makes the passive trees a bit different and a lot more specialized if you want to incorporate poison, bleed, or ignite into your builds, rather than just getting it with a very generic passive tree. Next up on the list is something that has been a problem for a long time, and that's ailment immunities. So monsters and endgame bosses that are immune to shock, chill, freeze, all that sort of stuff, negating some pretty strong perks of lightning or cold builds. And they're going to be changing that, because currently, and how it's worked for a very long time, is that you shock or chill or freeze based off of the amount of damage you do to a monster by a percentage of its health. So if you deal like half of its health in one hit, then your freeze is going to be a very long time, or your shock is going to be a very long time. Instead of that, it sounds like they're going to make some changes to just, potentially specific durations of shock, or how long you can shock a monster for, or a boss. And as well as that, they're going to remove freeze immunity altogether and instead have something that's like a slow protection effect, so they won't be immobilized by freeze. Instead, they'll be slowed significantly on these endgame bosses, so it doesn't completely make your cold build useless in what it does as a bonus for freeze or chill. And it does make some of those builds quite a lot more enticing at this point. Then we have a fairly significant change that's not strictly to do with damage over time and all that, which is weapon elemental damage. So currently we have elemental damage with weapons on your passive tree. So things like this guy here, increased elemental damage with weapons. Instead of that, it's going to now be elemental damage with attack skills. Now what that means specifically is elemental damage with weapons, for example, like they do in Infernal Blow. You scale with your initial hit with elemental damage with weapons, but it doesn't affect the secondary part of Infernal Blow, because it's not the damage done with the weapon at all. Instead, when it's elemental damage with attack skills, that includes everything in that Infernal Blow, and as well as that in the Ignite. So it's going to be scaling all sorts of things and just make it a bit simpler to understand when you take this sort of node, exactly what you're going to be getting. And most importantly, this sort of shit will now be applied to unarmed attacks, because it's now with attack skills rather than with weapons. Unarmed never had weapons, so it was really hard to build unarmed elemental damage builds. So Doriana's Fist was notoriously terrible because weapon elemental damage gem doesn't work for it, and pretty much none of the passives on the tree do. Whereas now they will, and that makes something like Doriana's Fist a lot more interesting to build around with, and I have a feeling we'll see quite a few of those builds running around. As well as that, Facebreaker, Ice Crash, Infernal Blow, that sort of shit will be stronger than it's ever been, and a lot more tantalizing in its option as a build. And as well as that, they say they're going to nerf the weapon elemental damage gem because it's far too good. I imagine it'll go from like 40%, or I think it's 50% right now, to like 35 or 40%. It'll still be good, don't worry, you'll still use it everywhere. They then mention a bunch of new mods that are going to come out on all kinds of weapons: daggers, claws, swords, bows, scepters, wands. The important stuff there is increased poison on, some of these things will just be something you may actually look out for when building a poison build. some chance to bleed, increased bleeding damage, chance to ignite, chance to freeze, and as well as that, we're looking at increased fire damage, cold damage, and lightning damage on scepters, staves, and wands, similar to how the spell damage prefixes currently work, where you can have much more specific built items for your builds. So you'll have, you know, a potential increased fire damage on a scepter that goes up to like 70%, for example, and it opens up another world of crafting that sort of shit. But the real issue there is it's going to make crafting all of these items a lot harder for what we currently craft them for. They say they'll, you know, keep an eye on that, but it's just probably the same as how they introduced spell damage attached to a spell on the current, you know, daggers and staves and all that sort of shit. It's just another layer of mods that's hard to get around when crafting something specific like, you know, an attack damage weapon. So that'll probably be a bit of a nuisance. But most importantly and lastly, projectile damage, area damage, those won't really like double dip anymore. So currently they've used an example of Essence Drain. It's a projectile skill. When you take a projectile damage node, you buff your Essence Drain's damage over time, its initial hit, and every damage over time associated with it, which is a poison and a decay as well. And neither the poison nor the decay is going to be affected by projectile damage anymore. So you don't get all of that sweet extra poison and decay on Essence Drain anymore, and it basically has killed the Delirium weapon, and quite potentially going to be killing Essence Drain if they don't buff it appropriately. They are saying they're going to, you know, adjust accordingly, and hopefully Essence Drain will still be usable, but, you know, I'm a little bit skeptical. They may kill Essence Drain, because poison and decay are very largely used and relied upon right now for your single target to not be garbage as Essence Drain, and we'll have to see how that goes when it gets changed. Likewise, for area damage, it won't be affected to all your poison and ignite for every single area skill you use anymore for that sort of stuff, which is going to be a nerf too. Overall, I think this is just going to specifically kill a lot of the current builds, especially ones that I've played, like Dream Feather, Spectral Throw, Mortem Morsu Spectral Throw. Quite a lot of Spectral Throws basically are going to be killed that previously relied on a lot of poison double dipping and all of that. It's going to be tough to see what builds survive, but I do think you won't be able to just slap poison onto anything, especially projectile skills. You know, Barrage, Tornado Shot, that might also suffer quite a bit too. All in all, there's going to be quite a shake-up in the meta of our builds and skills and how we scale damage with Path of Exile in 3.0, and there's, you know, quite a lot of other FAQ stuff you can look over, but there's nothing too specific that affects us that really needs to be gone over, but you can check those and those. You know, the game just gets pretty complicated at this stage, and there's a lot to read over and look over when changes come by. And I personally hate doing it. I just rather test things as they come out and enjoy them and see what works, what doesn't, rather than theorycraft and predict and try to understand every single piece of information about Path of Exile. It just gets a bit overwhelming at the end, and it is still supposed to be a game, so you know, I try not to go over this stuff too much or in too much detail, but as, you know, streamer and YouTuber, I do want to pass on the information to you, so I have to go out of my way to read and understand it, even if I struggle, which I do. So that's about it for that, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this helped, or, you know, just some background noise, and I'll see you next time.